In the remote corners of forests, abandoned cabins, dusty barns, and forgotten wilderness trails, an invisible danger has existed quietly for decades. A danger carried not by armies, governments, or advanced weapons, but by tiny creatures most people barely notice. Rodents. For years, scientists struggled to understand a mysterious illness that seemed to appear without warning. Healthy people would suddenly develop fever, exhaustion, muscle pain, and severe breathing problems. Within days, some victims were fighting for their lives inside intensive care units. Doctors were confused. Communities became terrified. And investigators desperately searched for answers. The illness eventually became known as hantavirus. Unlike many infectious diseases that spread rapidly from person to person, hantavirus carried a different kind of fear. Infection often came silently, from contaminated dust, hidden rodent droppings, or microscopic particles disturbed in isolated environments. You could enter an old cabin, sweep a dusty storage room, or clean an abandoned garage without realizing danger was already in the air around you. And once symptoms began, the disease could become deadly with terrifying speed. The story of hantavirus is not just about a virus. It is a story about humanity's relationship with nature, the hidden dangers surrounding wildlife, and how invisible pathogens can remain unnoticed for years before suddenly emerging as major public health threats. Long before modern medicine identified hantavirus, the virus already existed quietly in rodent populations around the world. Scientists later discovered that different strains of hantaviruses had evolved over thousands of years alongside specific rodent species. Unlike some viruses that constantly jump between animals, hantaviruses became closely linked to particular hosts. Each strain developed its own ecological relationship. Some were carried by rats, others by field mice. And in North America, one of the most dangerous strains became associated with the deer mouse. The rodents themselves often appeared completely healthy, but they could spread the virus through saliva, urine, and droppings. When these materials dried, tiny viral particles could become airborne and enter the human body through breathing. The danger was nearly invisible. Unlike large predators or obvious environmental hazards, hantavirus could not be seen, smelled, or easily detected without scientific testing. Exposure could happen silently in ordinary environments people considered harmless. For decades, isolated outbreaks appeared in different regions of the world without scientists fully understanding the cause. One of the earliest major clues emerged during the Korean War in the early 1950s. Thousands of United Nations soldiers fighting on the Korean peninsula began developing a mysterious illness marked by fever, kidney failure, bleeding disorders, and severe weakness. The condition became known as Korean hemorrhagic fever. At the time, doctors had little understanding of what was causing it. The illness spread fear among troops stationed in rugged rural environments where rodent populations were common near military camps and trenches. Years later, researchers finally traced the disease to a hantavirus strain carried by local rodents. The discovery shocked scientists. It revealed that dangerous rodent-borne viruses had likely existed in nature for far longer than humans realized. More importantly, it showed how easily human activity in wilderness or rural environments could suddenly expose populations to hidden pathogens. As research expanded, scientists discovered additional hantavirus strains across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Some primarily attacked the kidneys. Others severely damaged the lungs. Certain strains caused bleeding disorders while others triggered rapid respiratory failure. The virus family proved far more widespread and complex than originally believed. At the same time, researchers began understanding how environmental conditions influenced outbreaks. Changes in climate, rainfall, food supply, and rodent population growth could all affect the likelihood of human exposure. In some regions, periods of heavy rainfall increased vegetation growth, which supported booming rodent populations. More rodents often meant higher exposure risks. Nature itself played a role in the cycle of infection. This connection between environment, wildlife, and disease became increasingly important to scientists studying emerging infectious threats around the world. But despite growing scientific knowledge, hantavirus remained largely unknown to the general public for many years. Most people had never heard of it. The virus existed quietly in the background of medical research while ordinary life continued across rural communities, forests, farms, and wilderness areas. Then everything changed in the early 1990s. A terrifying outbreak in the United States would suddenly bring hantavirus into international headlines, and reveal just how deadly the invisible virus hidden in nature could truly become. In the spring of 1993, a terrifying medical mystery suddenly emerged in the American Southwest. The outbreak began in the remote Four Corners region, where the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. The area was known for its deserts, isolated communities, ancient landscapes, and rural wilderness. At first, the illness seemed almost impossible to understand. Young and otherwise healthy people were suddenly becoming critically ill without warning. Victims developed flu-like symptoms that rapidly transformed into severe respiratory failure. Within days, and sometimes within hours, patients were struggling to breathe as their lungs filled with fluid. Some died before doctors fully understood what was happening. Communities quickly became frightened. Rumors spread across small towns and reservations as people searched for explanations. Many feared a new epidemic was beginning. Others worried about environmental contamination or a previously unknown infectious disease spreading through the region. Doctors were alarmed by the speed of the illness. The symptoms often began mildly: fever, fatigue, muscle aches, headaches, nausea. At first, many patients appeared to have ordinary influenza or another common viral infection. But then the condition suddenly became far more dangerous. Victims developed severe coughing, chest tightness, and breathing difficulties as fluid rapidly filled their lungs. Some patients deteriorated so quickly that emergency medical teams struggled to stabilize them in time. Hospitals were overwhelmed with uncertainty. Medical professionals had never seen anything quite like it. Healthy young adults were entering hospitals in respiratory collapse with no obvious explanation. The mortality rate quickly raised alarm. Several patients died despite aggressive emergency treatment, increasing fears that the outbreak involved an extremely dangerous pathogen. As panic grew, public health investigators rushed into the Four Corners region. Teams from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, state health departments, epidemiologists, and infectious disease experts began investigating the mysterious outbreak. Their mission was urgent: identify the cause before more people died. At first, theories varied widely. Some investigators suspected chemical poisoning or environmental toxins. Others feared a new airborne disease. Some even wondered whether an unknown biological threat had emerged in the region. But as investigators interviewed victims' families and studied the environments where patients had lived, a disturbing pattern slowly began to appear. Many victims had recent exposure to places with heavy rodent activity: cabins, storage sheds, trailers, barns, dusty buildings, rural homes. Some had cleaned abandoned structures shortly before becoming sick. Others had spent time in enclosed areas contaminated with mouse droppings. The connection became impossible to ignore. Scientists soon focused their attention on local rodent populations, especially deer mice commonly found throughout the Southwest. Laboratory testing eventually confirmed the terrifying truth. Researchers identified a previously unknown hantavirus strain carried by deer mice in the region. The virus was later named sin nombre virus, meaning no-name virus. The discovery shocked public health officials across the country. The realization that a deadly virus could spread through airborne particles from rodent waste created enormous fear, especially in rural communities where encounters with mice were extremely common. Suddenly, ordinary places no longer felt safe. People began questioning old cabins, garages, campsites, sheds, woodpiles, and storage areas that had once seemed harmless. The idea that invisible viral particles could linger inside dust-filled environments deeply unsettled the public. Media coverage intensified the fear. News reports described mysterious deaths, unexplained respiratory collapse, and hidden dangers lurking inside abandoned buildings. Television programs warned viewers about rodent infestations and airborne contamination. The outbreak quickly became national news. At the same time, scientists worked desperately to understand how the virus spread and how infections could be prevented. One major discovery proved especially important. Sweeping rodent droppings could accidentally increase exposure risk. When contaminated droppings dried and became disturbed, viral particles could enter the air where they might be inhaled. This changed public health recommendations immediately. Officials warned people not to sweep or vacuum areas contaminated with rodent waste. Instead, they recommended ventilation, disinfectants, protective gloves, and careful cleanup procedures designed to reduce airborne exposure. Simple safety precautions suddenly became life-saving advice. Ventilating enclosed spaces before entering. Wearing masks and gloves. Using disinfectants rather than dry sweeping. Sealing holes where rodents entered homes. Public awareness campaigns spread rapidly throughout affected regions. The outbreak also revealed how closely human health could be connected to environmental conditions. Researchers later discovered that unusually heavy rainfall before the outbreak had increased plant growth across parts of the Southwest. The additional vegetation created more food for rodents, causing deer-mouse populations to grow dramatically. More mice meant greater opportunities for human exposure. Nature itself had helped create the conditions for the outbreak. As scientists continued studying the virus, they also realized the Four Corners outbreak was not an isolated mystery. Similar hantavirus infections had likely occurred previously but were either misdiagnosed or never fully identified. The 1993 outbreak forced the medical world to confront a disturbing reality. Dangerous diseases could exist quietly in nature for years before suddenly emerging into public awareness. The fears surrounding hantavirus became psychological as well as medical. Unlike visible threats, viral exposure often happened invisibly. A person could inhale contaminated particles without realizing it. Symptoms might not appear for days or weeks. And once severe illness developed, survival was no longer guaranteed. For many people, the outbreak permanently changed how they viewed wilderness environments and abandoned structures. The forests, deserts, cabins and rural landscapes of the American Southwest suddenly carried an invisible new danger. And although the outbreak was eventually contained, the virus itself had not disappeared. Hantavirus is terrifying not only because of where it hides, but because of how quickly it can overwhelm the human body once infection begins. The virus often enters silently. A person may inhale microscopic particles from dried rodent urine, saliva, or droppings without realizing exposure has even occurred. Simply sweeping a dusty cabin floor, opening an abandoned shed, or disturbing contaminated material can release viral particles into the air. The danger is nearly invisible. Unlike obvious environmental threats, hantavirus exposure usually happens without warning signs. There is no strong smell, visible cloud, or immediate pain to alert someone that infection may already be taking place. After exposure, the virus enters the body through the respiratory system. At first, nothing may seem wrong. The incubation period can last several days or even weeks before symptoms appear. During this time, infected individuals often continue normal daily activities completely unaware that the virus is already spreading inside their body. Then the first symptoms begin. In many cases, the illness initially resembles common influenza or other ordinary viral infections. Fever, fatigue, headaches, muscle pain, chills, nausea. Because the symptoms appear so ordinary at first, hantavirus can be extremely difficult to recognize during its early stage. Some patients assume they simply have the flu. Others try to rest at home without seeking medical attention. But behind the scenes, the virus may already be triggering a dangerous immune response inside the body. One of the most severe forms of the disease is known as hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, often shortened to HPS. This stage is where the illness can become life-threatening with terrifying speed. After several days of early flu-like symptoms, patients may suddenly experience rapid worsening of their condition. Breathing becomes difficult. The chest feels tight. Coughing intensifies. Extreme exhaustion develops. Inside the lungs, fluid begins leaking into air sacs responsible for oxygen exchange. As the lungs fill with fluid, the body struggles to receive enough oxygen. Patients often describe the sensation as feeling unable to breathe properly, as if their lungs are slowly shutting down. At this point, emergency hospitalization becomes critical. Many severe cases require intensive care units, oxygen therapy, and mechanical ventilators to help patients continue breathing. Doctors during the 1993 outbreak were shocked by how rapidly patients deteriorated. Some individuals went from mild fever to respiratory collapse within a very short period of time. In severe cases, blood pressure dropped dangerously low while organs throughout the body began struggling from lack of oxygen. The mortality rate alarmed medical experts. Certain hantavirus strains carried fatality rates significantly higher than many common respiratory illnesses. Even with modern intensive care treatment, some patients could not be saved once the disease reached advanced stages. Unlike bacterial infections, antibiotics do not cure hantavirus because the illness is caused by a virus rather than bacteria. And unlike some other viral diseases, there is still no universally effective specific cure designed solely for hantavirus infections. Doctors instead rely heavily on supportive treatment. This may include oxygen support, intravenous fluids, careful monitoring, ventilators, and intensive respiratory management. The earlier supportive care begins, the greater the chance of survival. That is why rapid recognition of symptoms became so important after the outbreaks in the American Southwest. Public health officials worked to educate communities about warning signs, especially for people exposed to rodent-contaminated environments. Understanding exposure history could save lives. If a patient with severe flu-like symptoms had recently cleaned a rodent-infested cabin or worked inside dusty rural buildings, doctors learned to consider hantavirus much earlier than before. Awareness became one of the strongest medical defenses. At the same time, researchers studied why the virus caused such severe damage in some patients. Scientists discovered that part of the danger came from the body's own immune response. As the immune system fought the infection, inflammation increased inside blood vessels and lung tissue. This contributed to fluid leakage, swelling, and respiratory failure. In some cases, the body's defensive response became part of the medical crisis itself. Different hantavirus strains could also affect the body in different ways. Certain strains found in Asia and Europe were more strongly associated with kidney damage and internal bleeding. Others, particularly some strains in the Americas, caused severe pulmonary complications affecting the lungs. The global diversity of hantaviruses made research even more complicated. But despite the severity of the disease, one important fact helped prevent widespread global panic. Hantavirus usually does not spread easily from person to person. This distinction became extremely important in public health messaging. Unlike highly contagious airborne pandemics, most hantavirus infections occur through environmental exposure to infected rodent waste rather than direct human transmission. That means prevention focuses primarily on reducing exposure to contaminated environments. Public health officials developed strict safety recommendations after the Four Corners outbreak. People were warned never to sweep or vacuum rodent droppings directly because doing so could launch viral particles into the air. Instead, experts recommended ventilating enclosed spaces, spraying disinfectant, wearing gloves and masks, carefully cleaning contaminated surfaces, and sealing homes against rodent entry. Simple precautions could dramatically reduce risk. For hikers, campers, farmers, rural workers, and homeowners, hantavirus awareness became an important part of wilderness and environmental safety. The virus also revealed something larger about emerging infectious diseases. Human beings often share environments with animals carrying pathogens that remain hidden for years before suddenly entering public awareness. As humans continue expanding into wilderness areas and disturbing natural ecosystems, contact with these diseases can increase. Hantavirus became one example of a much broader scientific concern. Many dangerous viruses already exist quietly in nature long before humans fully recognize them. Even today, scientists continue monitoring hantavirus cases around the world. Cases still appear every year. Hantavirus changed more than medical research. It changed the way many people viewed nature itself. For decades, forests, mountains, barns, cabins, and remote wilderness areas had been associated with adventure, survival, and freedom. But outbreaks of hantavirus revealed that nature could also hide invisible biological dangers capable of emerging without warning. The virus became a reminder that humanity does not fully control the natural world. Even in the modern age of advanced medicine, satellites, artificial intelligence, and global scientific networks, microscopic pathogens still exist quietly beyond public attention, waiting for the right environmental conditions to spread. And hantavirus was not limited to one country. Scientists eventually identified hantavirus strains across Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. Different regions experienced different forms of the disease depending on the local rodent species carrying the virus. Some strains attacked the lungs. Others caused kidney failure and internal bleeding. Certain outbreaks remained isolated while others raised fears of wider public health emergencies. The global presence of hantaviruses revealed something deeply important to scientists. Emerging diseases are often connected directly to wildlife ecosystems. Nature itself functions as a vast biological network where viruses, animals, climate, and environment constantly interact. When those systems change, disease patterns can change as well. Researchers began studying how environmental shifts influenced hantavirus outbreaks. One major factor involved rodent population growth. Periods of increased rainfall sometimes produced larger vegetation growth across certain regions. More vegetation created more food for rodents, which allowed mouse and rat populations to expand rapidly. As rodent numbers increased, so did opportunities for human exposure. A single environmental shift could quietly increase infection risk across entire communities without people realizing it. This connection between climate and disease became increasingly important in scientific discussions. Some researchers warned that environmental disruption, climate change, deforestation, and human expansion into wilderness areas could increase future contact between humans and animal-borne pathogens. Hantavirus became part of a much larger global concern: the rise of zoonotic diseases. These are diseases that spread from animals to humans. History has shown repeatedly that some of humanity's most dangerous outbreaks originated within animal populations long before crossing into human society. Scientists realized that the natural world contains countless viruses still poorly understood, or completely undiscovered. Hantavirus was one example of how hidden pathogens could suddenly emerge into public awareness. At the same time, the virus created a powerful psychological fear. Unlike visible threats, hantavirus exposure often feels deeply unsettling because infection happens invisibly. A person may never see the contaminated particles they inhale. They may not know exposure occurred until days later. And by the time severe symptoms appear, the disease may already be life-threatening. That uncertainty affects people emotionally as much as physically. Campers, hikers, farmers, hunters, rural workers, and homeowners began viewing abandoned structures and rodent-infested environments differently after learning about hantavirus risks. Old cabins no longer seemed entirely harmless. Dusty storage buildings suddenly carried hidden danger. Even simple cleaning activities became associated with invisible biological threats. Media coverage intensified this fear. Documentaries, news reports, and survival programs frequently described hantavirus as one of the hidden dangers of wilderness environments. Stories of sudden respiratory collapse and mysterious outbreaks captured public attention because the threat felt both ordinary and terrifying at the same time. The virus did not require war zones, laboratories, or crowded cities. It could exist quietly inside a forgotten shed. Despite this fear, public health education dramatically improved over time. Scientists and health agencies developed clearer safety guidelines designed to reduce exposure risk. Communities learned safer cleanup methods, rodent prevention strategies, and warning signs associated with hantavirus infection. Awareness became one of the strongest defenses. People were taught to ventilate enclosed spaces before entering them, to avoid sweeping rodent droppings directly, to wear gloves and protective masks, to use disinfectants instead of dry cleaning methods, and to seal homes against rodent intrusion whenever possible. Simple precautions saved lives. Modern medicine also became far better at recognizing the disease. Doctors now identify warning signs more rapidly than during the mysterious outbreaks of the early 1990s. Intensive care treatment and early supportive therapy have improved survival rates for many patients. Yet the virus has not disappeared. Cases still emerge around the world every year. Scientists continue monitoring rodent populations, environmental conditions, and outbreak patterns carefully. Researchers also study how future climate shifts and expanding human activity may influence the spread of animal-borne diseases in coming decades. Because hantavirus revealed a larger truth about modern civilization. Human beings are deeply connected to natural ecosystems whether they realize it or not. As cities expand, forests shrink, climates shift, and wildlife habitats change, interactions between humans and hidden pathogens may continue increasing. Diseases once isolated within remote animal populations can suddenly become major medical emergencies when environmental balance changes. The story of hantavirus ultimately became more than a story about one virus. It became a warning. A warning that nature still contains countless biological mysteries beyond human control. A reminder that invisible threats can emerge silently from ordinary environments. And proof that scientific understanding, public awareness, and environmental responsibility are essential for protecting human health in the future. Even today, somewhere inside forests, deserts, barns, mountains, and abandoned buildings, rodents still carry hantaviruses quietly through the natural world. Most people will never encounter the disease. But the possibility remains hidden in the dust. And that lingering uncertainty continues to make hantavirus one of the most unsettling examples of nature's invisible dangers.